Thanks for joining us on Capitol View. I'm Fred Martino. This week, after the conviction of former Illinois House Leader Michael Madigan, will ethics reforms be approved? There's reaction to Governor J.B. Pritzker's call to restrict cell phones in classrooms, and an update on a plan to replace gas pipelines in the state. Those stories and more with Jeremy Gorner of the Chicago Tribune and Charlie Wheeler. He is Emeritus Director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois Springfield. Before we begin the program this week, former Governor Jim Edgar revealed that he is fighting pancreatic cancer. We wish the governor and his family all the best from Capitol View. Jeremy, last week you covered the big story. Governor J.B. Pritzker proposed a budget calling for restraint in spending. In fact, he proposed canceling a very expensive health care program for some immigrants. The budget assumes a better financial picture than what was previously expected. What is your take on where all of this will end up?
Well, it's interesting, Fred, because in the last couple of years, especially as we saw last year, where it took the Democrats 3 tries at the end of May to pass a budget, that was because of moderate Democrats who were in the midst of an election year. We're not comfortable passing a budget that they felt was bloated and over and kind of controversial, some overspending there there was a raise in, that many people thought. And there was, taxes were raised by, more than $750 million, many of them on on legalized gambling issues. But, that didn't sit too well with moderate Democrats in the legislature. Now, the moderate Democrats seem to be okay with the governor's proposal. There is a little bit of belt tightening despite a little bit more spending. But it's progressive Democrats who are a little uneasy because of cuts that the governor is proposing in the upcoming budget, including this immigrant health care program, which I'm sure that we've talked about on this show before, has had issues, since it's been in place in the last 5 years, with the state overestimating enrollment and overestimating the costs, leaving Democrats wide open to criticism by Republicans who, of course, have always called for fiscal restraint in these budgets, no matter what the budget year. So I think it'll be interesting to see, where it was moderate Democrats who were kind of endangering the budget process for Democrats last year. It'll be interesting to see how progressives react to this budget. I mean, primarily, the immigrant health care was the big one that was cut. There's also been cuts to welcoming centers for asylum seekers that have come to Illinois, Chicago area, and the rest of Illinois. Of course, the number of asylum seekers has dwindled, I believe, in the last year or so. But another point I wanted to make about immigrant health care, when we were asking Governor Pritzker about why he's cutting one of the programs, which, by the way, there's 2 programs. There's one that affects folks who are under the age of 65, so primarily that age 42 through 64 range, and then anyone who is over 65 is a separate program. The 42 to 64-year-olds, for them, that program is what the governor is proposing to cut. And his justification for it is, this is when you are of that age range, you are part of the workforce. And he says that he's heard of cases where you have people in that age group who are enrolled in the program, and then they get good enough paying jobs where they get health care benefits through work. So why do they need to be on the state-run healthcare program? So that was one justification that Pritzker threw out there for why he wanted to cut the program. But he also had to make cuts. Is proposing cuts to his early child care initiative, which is something that he is really near and dear to his heart. That was like a cornerstone of one of his budget proposals in the last couple of years. So he has stressed to Democrats, he has stressed to lawmakers, including Democrats, his own allies, basically saying, look, basically like any budget, people are going to get left out. But if you really want something in this upcoming budget, then then you or we're going to have to come up with ideas together on what to cut. So this year, I think, before we see any kind of final proposal that's presented to the General Assembly in May, I mean, it's pretty clear that Pritzker has drawn a line in the sand here.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see where it all ends up. Beyond the immediate concerns, of course, the governor has been communicating, according to reports, with the federal government about difficulty accessing federal funds that have already been allocated. And then you have the concern about the future, because Republicans this week passed a framework for a federal budget that includes a lot more cuts that would be devastating for many states. One of the biggest concerns is, of course, Medicaid, which is the health care program for about 1 in 4 Americans. We often forget that when we talk about that program. It is enormous and different, of course, state to state. But this is another unknown, and something that we'll be watching in addition to the immediate negotiations in Springfield. And of course, we should say, Jeremy, you are in Springfield, so you'll be at the pulse of this for some time. Before we move on, just really quickly, I wanted to ask you, are you hearing in Springfield any concern about the fact that the governor has been one of the most outspoken critics of President Trump?
I don't want to say concern. I mean, don't forget there's Democratic supermajorities in both chambers. I would assume that a lot of these lawmakers probably tend to agree with the governor and the anti-Trump stance he's taken. I know that the governor upset several Republicans, many Republicans last week during his speech at the Capitol. When he invoked when he talked about Nazism and the rise of Nazism in Germany in the 1930s and compared that to the modern day Republican Party. You had some Republicans who headed towards the exits in the House chamber for that, which that kind of talking point from Democrats really isn't anything new. But I mean, he really is like the formidable Democratic leader in this country who's taken an aggressive stance against Donald Trump. You're not really seeing that from a lot of other Democrats, and
Yeah.
that could be for many reasons. I mean, it could be that some other Democrats, in this country, are thinking maybe we need to be more moderate if we're going to win elections again on the national level. But Pritzker's been kind of sticking to his guns there. He's been pretty consistent in his rhetoric against Trump. And, to your point about the budget, yeah, I mean, I believe that the governor said yesterday around $1.8 billion is being withheld, or could be withheld, from the state because of this. And that's not even factored into the budget proposal from last week. So
Right, right.
that's to your point, that is going to be another added layer between now and May. So we'll see what happens.
We'll see. Oh, my goodness. Lots of concern there. Charlie, with the recent conviction of former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan, you might think, in addition to the budget, legislators would be anxious to tackle ethics reform. But recently, columnist Rich Miller says we might not want to expect reform anytime soon. Tell us more and your thoughts on this.
Well, I will cut to the chase, and I will say that, make a prediction. It's more likely that the White Sox will win the World Series this year than that the legislature will pass any meaningful ethics reform. Well, Rich talked to House Speaker Emanuel Chris Welch, and he said that Welch told him he was, and this was Rich's quote, he was proud that nobody in his caucus had been accused of corruption since he took over. And here's a quote, I'll read it from Welch. We addressed ethics in my first year as Speaker. There's a number of things that we have done that I think really changed the environment and have helped us to get to the point that we're at today. So he doesn't sound like he's really gung-ho to do anything. And as a matter of fact, in the story that Jeremy and his colleagues did after Madigan's conviction, they interviewed the Senate President Don Harmon, and his quote was, "The jury's verdict closes a long, disturbing chapter in Illinois history. It's a stark reminder that corruption, abuse of power, manipulation, public policy for personal gain can never be tolerated. We cannot be effective if people don't trust us. Yet every failure is an opportunity. In recent years, we have worked to restore that trust through balanced budgets, credit rating upgrades, community investment, sweeping bipartisan ethics reform." Well, nonpartisan observers, obviously Republicans and nonpartisan observers, the good government groups, thinks the notion of sweeping ethics reform is really a joke. And as a matter of
well, that's it lays it out there. Then, Charlie, you seem to agree with the columnist Rich Miller. We should not expect it, at least right now. Real quickly, before we move on, what would, in your view, drive interest in doing more in terms of ethics reform?
I really don't know, to be perfectly honest.
Sure. Yeah.
If the conviction of Michael Madigan, longest serving speaker in U.S. history, and for many years, basically the guy behind the General Assembly, if his conviction couldn't impel people to move, I don't know what will.
Yeah, that's what I thought you might say.
Government groups were recommending, and they came out after the conviction, a coalition of them, and they said, here are some of the things we need to do. And I went back and looked. 5 years ago, they were arguing for the same changes in the law, and nothing has happened since then. And as I said, nothing's going to happen this spring.
Okay, well, we'll move on now. Jeremy, Governor Pritzker has proposed a restriction on classroom use of cell phones. As you know, this is a popular idea that's sweeping the country. The Chicago Sun-Times recently talked about this with students. What did they find?
Well, it's a complicated issue, Fred. It's controversial. It's been around for a long time in the schools. Generally, you got a couple schools of thought here. No pun intended. You have, the fact that cell phones have really become a part of the culture. For young people, especially. With social media, with group texting, with the various apps that are out there. But, because of that age, there's been a lot of concern, about cyberbullying being an issue in schools and, phones being kind of the conduit towards that. That's one issue. Another issue is that, another issue basically is that, where proponents of this law, including Governor Pritzker, are saying basically that, if you take a kid's phone away during classroom instruction, they can focus a lot better. Keep in mind, this law looks like, or this proposal looks like it would have, limitations. It doesn't mean you can't take the phone in the school. It doesn't mean you're barred from taking a phone in the school outright, just not during classroom instruction. There's going to be, so basically what this proposal is calling for is for schools to come up with their own policies against the use of cell phones in the classroom. But then you have people who are against the proposal and, for security reasons. For instance, we've seen gun violence happen, inside schools and outside of schools, at various points. History in this country. And, there's some concerns about that. I know, and Charlie probably, has the institutional knowledge for this, but when former state rep Mary Flowers was in the legislature, uh, she was against any kind of effort to keep cell phones out of the hands of kids in school because of what happened at the during the mass shooting in a Columbine High School in Colorado in the late 90s. So, there's all sorts of varying opinions to this. But yeah, I mean, a lot of these kids, who have cell phones. Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's just become a fabric of who they are. I mean, it's really
Yeah.
become a cultural phenomenon. But again, for all those reasons that I kind of laid out, that's where you have, both sides. This has been an issue that has never gone that has been talked about for years and isn't going away. But now it looks like Pritzker is really kind of
Yeah.
wrapping his head around this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we will watch again. A lot of sides there, but certainly a big distraction in the classroom, and a lot of teachers uh, probably pleased with this call to have a strong state policy on asking schools to do something. Hopefully, we have time for two more stories. Charlie, a new report says that state regulators are clamping down on a People's Gas Pipeline replacement program. The Sun-Times reported on this. Tell us more.
Yeah, what it is that People's Gas for some time has been embarking on a program to basically replace all their infrastructure, all the pipes that carry natural gas to businesses and homes throughout Chicago. And the Illinois Commerce Commission, which paused the program a couple years ago because of concerns about cost overruns, has said, okay, you can start, but you have to concentrate on the oldest pipelines. There's roughly 1,000 miles of pipeline, some of which go back to the 1800s. And they're worried because these cast iron pipes are very prone to leak. And if a gas leak comes out, it'd be a horrible explosion. So the order says that the People's Gas has to focus on these older pipelines, and it has to have what would you call it? It has to have yearly reviews by outside authorities to see how these things are going. And the program, which began years ago, was over, oh, it's like $3.3 billion already, and less than half of the work has been done.
Wow.
The ruling will say the company has to restart work, has to focus on the highest risk pipes, and complete the work in 10 years. So we'll see what happens there. And they have 4,600 miles of gas pipes under the city. And as I say, some of it goes back to the 1800s. And the focus is going to be on the older pipes and get those replaced. Now, some of the consumer groups say, well, it's good to make them focus on these, but we also think that this whole notion of replacing all the infrastructure, all 4,000 miles, is really not looking to the future, because we expect that within the next 10 years, there will be a lot of replacement by renewable resources, electricity, for example, for stuff that gas is now used for. And Peoples obviously doesn't agree with that, but we'll see where it goes from here.
Yeah, and of course the problem is we're not there yet, but yeah, that's a debate happening, of course, Charlie, all over the country. Jeremy, at your newspaper, the Chicago Tribune, there has been continuing coverage of the Trump administration crackdown on immigration, including a recent report in the Tribune about arrests. Tell us more.
Yeah, so in late January, immigration agents swept the Chicago area, and basically this lit up phone screens. there were all these frenzied reports of sighting of immigration and customs enforcement agents around Chicago. The report talked about some of the experiences of these people who've been arrested, while, basically, knowing that ICE could be looking for them. Obviously we saw TV's Dr. Phil even join in the effort by ICE to look for undocumented people. And basically, as these scenes played out, ICE had disclosed that they made more than 950 arrests nationwide that day as part of President Trump's mass deportation proposal, or plan rather. In Chicago Police Superintendent Snelling, he said at least 100 people were arrested in Chicago and the surrounding area that day. This is January 26th. But basically what this story shows, that you're talking about, Fred, is that, a month later, we're a month after all this, precise information about who was arrested and why remains elusive. Federal officials have declined to release detailed information about these arrests. And, even though there's national data for the first few weeks of the Trump administration beginning to trickle in, there was one independent group that compiles these figures that says there's inconsistencies in a lot of what they're saying. There's, in terms of like who's arrested and why, apparently. And part of this is just that on the federal level, it's not like the county system where in Illinois, arrestees must go before a judge within 48 hours. And police must make arrest reports with identifying information available within 72 hours. In this federal system, in the immigration system, it's very Byzantine, very opaque, where people can be detained and not go to a judge for weeks. And that's what these reporters were really documenting in some of these cases. And obviously, the big thing we heard from the Trump administration is they're going after people with criminal records. Well, what does that mean? I mean, are we looking for people who are mass murderers, or are we looking for people who've gotten DUIs, not to, or, less serious crimes? And we don't know. And so the Tribune actually looking through, because some of these individuals were being detained in county jails, in Indiana and in Illinois, and elsewhere. And there were nearly 200 detainee names that the Tribune got a hold of. And about half of these people could not be located with confidence in national databases or public record searches to figure out, basically to figure out who these people were and what their backgrounds were. So basically what this story really is, it illustrates, like I said, is the Byzantine and opaque world of, immigration enforcement, where the public is really largely kept in the dark about what federal law enforcement is doing in these situations.
Yeah, and of course
these efforts rather.
Yeah, and of course one among many issues where transparency is a major concern. Jeremy, I only have 2 minutes left, but I wanted to touch on one final human rights story that you'll be hearing about in Springfield. State lawmakers are weighing whether to legalize medical aid in dying. What did you find out about that?
Yeah, so this issue actually was floated around during the previous legislative session last year, and it couldn't make it out of the General Assembly. So the lawmakers have ignited a renewed effort for this. Lawmakers are considering legalizing, what's called medical aid in dying. That some people refer to colloquially as assisted suicide. And, there's a couple schools of thought here. I mean, supporters have pointed to a majority of Illinois voters supporting legalized medical aid in dying in a 2023 poll. but there's other critics who call the process barbaric. State Senator Linda Holmes is the main sponsor in the Senate for this measure, and during a hearing last week in Chicago, she told her Senate colleagues that she supports the proposal because of her parents' deaths. Both her mother and father died after extended battles with cancer. So, basically what this, basically this proposal would be geared towards patients whose doctors determine have less than 6 months to live due to a terminal illness. And in this case, a patient could administer the drugs on their life-ending drugs on their own at the time of their choosing. But there's several safeguards to prevent abuse. According to proponents, this includes a waiting period to receive a prescription, a requirement that the patient receive a terminal diagnosis from 2 doctors, and a requirement that patients prescribed lethal medication have sufficient mental capacity.
Okay.
But yeah.
So there are safeguards in the bill. Very interesting. We'll continue to watch that, and of course, something that other states have passed, and something that we're probably going to see as a continuing issue with the aging population. We are out of time. Jeremy and Charlie, thank you so much for joining us this week.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Fred.
That is Capitol View. For everyone at WSIU, I'm Fred Martino. Have a good week.